好，那我们这一堂药理学实验的主题是战胜疼痛。好，这是我个人简历，不是很重要，但还是提一下好了。我是 P97的，那各位可以自己换算。那我现在是在国军花莲总医院服务，然后去年从那个药理所毕业的。好，我们直接进入我们今天的主题哈。那疼痛，然后战胜疼痛这个主题呢，先给大家来一点前言好了。如果你在临床上看到一位需要进行拔牙手术的那个患者哈，在躺着等待的过程中持续焦虑的询问着，等等手术过程会不会很痛？这个很常见。那另外呢，有一位外科手术的病患不断抱怨着麻醉失效后伤口非常的痛。那有以上2个小的 case， 我们就可以看得出来，其实在臨床上麻醉与止痛是手术的2大关键哈，而且口服的止痛药早就已经是人类生活不可或缺的部分。所以这一次我们的主题就围绕着麻醉与止痛。那等一下的影片中会带到一些就是发展史以及它的应用，然后再带到现今的情况。等一下影片教学的部分就分为这5大类。那第一开始的话，他会先讲吗啡的发现，然后以及麻醉气体的使用、止痛药的合成，然后静脉注射麻醉，以及最新的新型止痛药物开发的方向。那这个就我觉得比较重要，所以就先拿出来讲。那我们后续的话就是教500字心得，好不好？那500字心得，但是要切合主题，所以那个让大家不要跑题。那我就会选择就是我会限定在选择与疼痛或麻醉相关的药物，1种药物就好了，然后并与下列主题之一相关的，然后进行撰写。那这些主题呢，等一下在我们的影片当中都会有提到，我们最后的时候再给大家总结。那这个评量的部分也是等一下最后的话会再帮大家总结。好，等一下就开始我们的影片的部分。那影片它全长大概50分钟，然后大家可以聚焦一下，因为我们之后要写一个心得，所以大家可以聚焦在它里面提到哪些的药物，然后呢提到药物之后它用了哪些的机转，或者是这一类的药物里面你还有听过，或是你知道，或是你想要去找其他的与这一类药物相关的，然后去进行500字的一个报告都可以。然后我们话不多说，我们就直接开始来影片的部分。
In 1815, with Europe at war, 4 young Germans decided to do a particularly foolhardy experiment, one which would transform their lives and ours as well. One of them, a pharmacist, had created some intriguing crystals, which he carefully measured out. He was keen to see what effects they would have on his body. He dissolved them in alcohol and then diluted it with water. Since the crystals had recently been made and only previously tested on dogs, they had very little idea of what was going to happen. The answer was not much, so they did it again. Prost! This time there was pounding headache, nausea and extreme flushing. So naturally they decided to go even more extreme. They put the crystals directly on their tongues and washed them down with another shot of alcohol. Their leader, Friedrich Zertner, describes falling to the ground semi-conscious, in terrible pain and fingers twitching with every heartbeat. Somehow he managed to crawl his way over to a bottle of really strong vinegar. He swallowed it down and the rest he poured into the mouths of his unconscious assistants. They were all violently sick. Zertner had saved their lives by making them vomit, but he noted that for the next few days they continued feeling ill, aches, sickness and constipation. Swallowing the crystals had produced classic symptoms of opium overdose. Zertner was thrilled. He was the first person ever to extract the essence of opium, a white powder that he called morphium. He had given birth to a whole new science and opened a Pandora's box of good and evil. This series tells the extraordinary story of what Zertner unleashed. The remarkable medicines which today protect us against devastating disease. Just over there is a monster of biblical proportions, the smallpox virus. And the agonies of mortal life. I have here a big lump of raw opium. You almost want to lick it. Drugs that can be terrifyingly lethal. This is the most poisonous substance known to man. Or incredibly pleasurable. I have here my favorite drug of abuse. It's a story of 2 centuries of greed, luck, and genius. Oh, yes. Blimey, wow. This is such an odd and unnatural thing to do. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it, but let's see. Okay. Ah, God, that is just absolutely horrible. I'm just pushing a needle right through my hand. I don't know if it's got through the other end. Sticking out there. Ah! This is only possible because my hand has been numbed with local anaesthetic. So the fact that I can do that is a testimony, if you like, to modern medicine. 200 years ago, we had almost nothing. We had a few herbal medicines. If you're having your teeth pulled out or your leg cut off, then you were going to be in an awful lot of pain. Pain is such a visceral thing that it's not surprising that the quest to find a way to control it has been such a driving force in the history of drugs. For centuries, there was only one substance that could reliably relieve pain: opium. A resin extracted from poppies, it is one of mankind's oldest and most addictive drugs. Yet opium would give rise to today's giant pharmaceutical industry.
Opium's always been popular. It's always been very easy to tell what opium does because it acts in a very obvious way and acts very quickly. The Sumerians called it the joy plant.
By the beginning of the 19th century, opium was widely available in Europe. It was particularly popular when dissolved in alcohol as a medicine called laudanum. Trouble is, the raw material was expensive and it was unreliable. So no wonder pharmacists began to ask themselves, what exactly is in opium that gives it its seemingly magical qualities? One of those pharmacists was the 20-year-old German Friedrich Zertner, whose attempts to produce morphium nearly ended in his death and the death of all his assistants. His experiments would unlock the key, not just to pain relief, but to all modern medicines. It took Zertner 2 years of trial and painful error before he discovered how to extract morphium from opium resin. I'm hoping to do it in rather less time than that, but because morphium is now a Class A drug, I'm going to have to do it in licensed premises. Zertner would have started with raw opium, which comes from the sap of the poppy. Now, I have an enormous great block of the stuff here. Still smells sort of yeasty. Time to extract morphium. First, Zertner added a standard solvent, alcohol. The alcohol should already be beginning to extract the chemicals from the raw opium. This, in essence, is laudanum, the sort of tonic they used in the 19th century. Gave it to squawking babies.
one of the ideas which actually comes from alchemy is the idea that there might be some active principle, something that lay at the heart of your substance, which gave it its power. And from there, it's actually not a huge step to say, well, what if we take away the alcohol? What are we left with? You know, are we left with that fundamental principle?
The first thing he managed to extract was a substance that was acidic. He tried it on dogs, and absolutely nothing happened.
Instead of giving up, Zertner tried doing something no one else had previously attempted. The received wisdom was the only really important chemicals in plants were sharp-tasting acids. But Zertner decided to see if he could extract an alkaline chemical, the opposite of an acid, from opium. He was exploring the unknown.
When you actually try and do it with modern equipment, it gives you a huge respect for what they were doing back then, because every stage would last weeks, and he obviously had no real idea what he was doing.
Finally, around 1803, he got this sludgy precipitate.
From this very unpromising substance, Zertner managed to extract some white crystals. When he gave these to a dog, the dog became sleepy, trembled, and then died. Zertner was absolutely thrilled. He published and sat back waiting for the applause, which never came. It seems that people just weren't that interested in the workings of a young man doing his bit in a small back room.
It was not until 10 years later, when Zertner purified and took the morphium himself, with his 3 assistants, that his dramatic discovery finally caught the attention of early chemists.
Gay-Lussac, who was a doyen of chemistry in Paris, probably the greatest chemist in the world of his day, he decided that this paper that had been brought to his attention should be translated into French and published, and therefore went around the world, and the world knew about this isolation. That was so important.
In extracting the active ingredient of opium, Zertner had launched a new age of discovery. He had shown that the powers of herbal remedies could be captured in a chemical form, measured out and quantified as a dose. He had also revealed a whole new world of previously unsuspected chemicals hiding in plants. They were to become our first real medicines.
They decided to call these new chemicals they were getting out of plants the alkaloids. They also decided to give them the name ene, I-N-E at the end. And so Zertner's white powder became not morphium, but morphine.
The isolation of morphine was the single most important event that has ever occurred in drug discovery. Far more important than the introduction of penicillin in terms of advancing the science.
Extraction of morphine was such a big moment in the history of medicine, because once you had the pure chemical, you could give it in a controlled and measured dose. You're no longer dependent on the vagaries of whatever plant you happen to be eating. It also meant they could extract dozens of different alkaloids.
Nature's medicine cabinet was flung wide open. It turned out that alkaloids are the reason why many herbal remedies are effective. Being the plant's own defense against herbivores, a lot were bitter tasting and poisonous. But once isolated, we could start to use them, and not just as painkillers.
Now I have here my favorite drug of abuse, caffeine.
Other famous alkaloids include nicotine and the malaria drug quinine. And here's another I take from time to time.
Codeine was another powerful painkiller which was extracted from the poppy. Codeine, like morphine, works by modulating the way that the brain perceives pain.
Surprisingly, we are only now beginning to understand how these so-called opiate drugs work. Normally, raw nerve endings trigger an electrical signal which travels to the spine. There it's converted into a chemical signal, which crosses into other nerves, which then transmit the message to the brain.
Once your brain has received that pain message, it can decide to tone it down or indeed switch it off entirely.
It does that via another set of nerves that send a signal down the spine, and that interrupts the incoming pain message. Our brains typically activate this pain-relieving pathway in times of extreme stress.
There are a number of different points along the pain pathway where you can turn the pain response down, and the opiates interact with quite a few of them.
For example, they make the brain switch on the pain-blocking pathways I've just described. They also act in the brain to reduce the impact of any pain messages that get through. There's even recent evidence they can dull the raw nerve endings at the site of pain. It's no wonder they're so effective.
The opiates are wonderful painkillers, but they do have significant side effects. Constipation, vomiting, addiction, and if they depress your breathing, death.
The opiates were all that patients had to relieve the agonies of life. But when it came to surgery, even this was bizarrely denied them.
Pain was understood as an essential component in terms of surgery. So although surgeons were concerned about the effects of pain on patients in terms of bearability, in terms of keeping a patient alive during an operation, it was regarded as part of the package.
A world where surgeons in frock coats committed acts of unspeakable horror would be changed by a dentist's chance discovery. But it was a breakthrough that was a long time coming. Throughout the 18th century, chemists had been experimenting with everything they could lay their hands on, from plants to rocks. They were particularly interested in creating gases.
One of the gases they produced, they did by heating up ammonium nitrate. Now, this gas was said to be incredibly poisonous. So it's surprising that a young chemist called Humphrey Davy was so keen not just to collect it, but also inhale it.
It's very hard, I think, to get back into the head of an 18th or 19th century chemist. And that's partly because there was so much self-experimentation that went on. Now, gases, you inhaled them, and these airs, as they called, were at one point sort of regarded as possibly panaceas, solutions for big medical problems. And the way in which they tested them was on themselves.
The young Humphrey Davy was desperate to make his name, which is probably why, despite the risks, he experimented with this new, potentially lethal gas. It was a foolhardy thing to do. I am doing it under carefully controlled conditions.
Ooh, nothing yet. Yes, there is. Okay. Now, he records it in his diaries that he started off feeling sort of sleepy and splenic, but after a couple of blasts of it, he started to want to dance around the room. Oh, yes, I'm feeling it now. Lightheaded. Yeah, I can see why they call it laughing gas. He also wrote other things in his notebooks, which I've entirely forgotten now. His notebooks, yes, he was writing something about, yes, there it goes. Now, one of the things that he noticed and wrote about, not in his notebooks later, is its effects on pain, that apparently it reduced it. Yeah, that's actually all right.
Davy published his discovery that nitrous oxide relieved pain and even stated its potential in surgery. And yet, tragically, he did nothing more about it.
For the next few decades, surgeons went on operating on fully conscious patients, and nitrous oxide was used mainly as a recreational drug for laughing gas parties.
It was at one of these in America that a young dentist called Horace Wells came across the gas and saw how effective it was at dulling pain. He realized that the horrors of tooth pulling or surgery could be relieved simply by giving the patient nitrous oxide. After experimenting first on himself and then on some patients, Wells realized he had stumbled across something truly miraculous, a gas that could open the way to pain-free surgery. So, he headed to Harvard Medical School in Boston to tell the elite surgeons what he had found. He invited a former partner of his, William Morton, who was also studying at the medical school, to accompany him and share his triumph.
On a cold winter's night in 1845, Wells and Morton appeared before a packed audience of doctors and medical students. Now, one of the medical students had a problem with his teeth, so he was summoned forward. He was given a good old blast of nitrous oxide from a bag that Wells had brought with him, and then Wells attempted to extract his painful tooth with a pair of pliers. No one's entirely clear what happened next, but the student made a noise. The audience interpreted that as a cry of pain, and soon there were hisses and cries of "humbug, humbug," which was a deadly medical insult. Utterly humiliated, Morton and Wells packed their bags and they left.
No one had imagined that anaesthesia could exist, and I think that's why Wells failed in his demonstration of nitrous oxide, because they found the very idea that pain was optional, that pain could be deleted, erased from the world, so intrinsically fraudulent that they were predisposed to reach that conclusion.
Wells was broken by this failure and would later commit suicide. But Morton had seen the commercial potential. He turned his attention to another substance, doing the rounds at student parties. By adding alcohol to sulfuric acid, the students produced a volatile liquid known as sweet oil of vitriol. When inhaled, it resulted in a very decent high.
Whoa, this is strong stuff. What is coming out of this is a vapor or liquid that we now know as ether.
Ether was a popular alternative to alcohol for teetotalers and was sometimes used in pain-relieving medicines. And it was this pain-killing effect that got Morton interested.
Morton started out by using a few drops of ether to numb the mouth. Then he used quite a lot to knock out a spaniel. But what he really needed to do to prove that it was safe and effective was try it on a human. With no other human volunteers to hand, Morton decided to try it out on himself. He got a handkerchief and applied some ether, looked at his watch, and then stuck the handkerchief over his face. A few minutes later, he woke up, but he was unable to move. As he later wrote, "I was terrified that I would die in that position, and the world would laugh at my folly." But the world never got a chance because he made a full recovery, and he was now very, very keen to try this out on someone else.
After successful trials on unsuspecting patients, Morton returned to Harvard Medical School. They agreed that Morton should have a second chance to demonstrate pain relief in the daunting domed surgical theatre at Massachusetts General Hospital. The date was set for October the 16th, 1846, just 16 days' time.
On that Friday, this room would have been absolutely packed with medical folk, many of them expecting and some of them hoping that the uppity dentist would fail again.
An eminent and extremely sceptical surgeon had been booked for the operation.
At 10 a.m., the appointed hour, there was no sign of Morton, so the surgeon prepared to operate. His patient was a young man with an enormous tumour on his neck. He would have been strapped down because he was going to be awake and screaming throughout. But before the surgeon could apply his scalpel to the quivering flesh, Morton came bursting into the room. He was carrying this.
It's an ether inhaler, and he'd had it built overnight. No time at all to test it, so he must have been feeling almost as anxious as the patient, but he had no idea if it was going to work. Filling the inhaler with ether, Morton handed it to the patient. He was relying on a complicated and untested system of valves to give the right dose. His future depended on this test succeeding. The Boston surgeons would not give him another chance. When the patient reported feeling a little bit groggy, Morton took it back, and then he turned to the surgeon and said, "Sir, your patient is ready." So the surgeon picked up his scalpel and he started to cut. From the patient there came not a sound. The operation was long and complicated, but also successful. At the end, the patient reported that he had felt no more than a scratch. This was an extraordinary moment in the history of surgery, an operation performed without pain. At the end, the surgeon turned to the audience and he said, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug."
There's a wonderful letter from the professor at Harvard to Morton saying everyone will want a share of your great discovery. I'm not trying to take a share, but we do need to give it a name. I would suggest the name anesthesia. And we need to give it a name because everyone throughout the world for the rest of human history will need to talk about what's just happened and what this is.
News spread about ether around the world within 6 months, which, given the communications network at the time, I think was highly significant. You just get the general sense that patience and social tolerance of pain is decreasing.
Pain was no longer an expected and tolerated part of everyday life. It was now something that could and should be minimized. In the 50 years since Zertner's isolation of morphine, a rush of scientific discoveries had replaced old superstitions and beliefs with new knowledge. This would set researchers off hunting for pain-killing drugs in some very unlikely places. By the middle of the 19th century, the mysterious world of herbs and tinctures was being replaced by white powders. And these, thanks to this invention, were in turn being replaced by tablets. We were about to enter the era where chemists could mass produce the sort of painkillers that we now routinely use every day. They were also about to create one of the most addictive substances known to man. And it all began with this stuff: coal tar. Coal tar was a waste product of the burgeoning coal gas industry, and naturally chemists tried to find profitable uses for it.
The availability of coal tar suddenly gives you an enormous new library of starting materials. And by then, chemistry was really kind of taking off. The connectivity, the structures were known. And it was suddenly realized that you might be able to make either the natural products themselves or things which mimic them. That was a real sea change in chemistry.
This sea change in chemistry started, as it was to proceed, with a series of mistakes. In 1845, an 18-year-old British chemist tried using coal tar to make quinine, a malaria drug. Instead, he created the first artificial dye, mauve, and made a fortune. Coal tar was clearly worth studying, yet it would take another accident to unlock its pain-killing potential. In this case, a giant cock-up involving two French doctors, Arnold Kahn and Paul Hepp, who were working here at the University of Strasbourg. They were testing chemicals derived from coal tar, which they were testing on patients with intestinal worms. Coal tar had been shown to have antiseptic properties when used on skin. So naturally enough, they wanted to see what effects some of its derivatives had inside the body. Fortunately, they had a ready supply of patients.
These were the days when doctors were quite happy to try almost anything on anybody. But even so, I'm amazed they managed to get patients to eat this stuff. It is incredibly pungent. It is naphthalene, the stuff they use these days in mothballs.
It did no harm to worms, but it did seem to have an effect.
Amazingly enough, one of their patients, who had a fever, reported that his fever went down after he'd eaten this stuff. That was great news. Followed soon afterwards by really bad news. There'd been a mix-up. Whatever the patient had been eating, it wasn't naphthalene.
The pharmacy here had made a terrible mistake with the labelling. The patient had actually been eating a completely unknown chemical.
It turned out that the chemical that the pharmacist had been accidentally dispensing was this one, acid anilide. Now, who knows how it got here, but it's actually used in the dye industry. But it was a most fortuitous accident.
They could have killed the man, but instead acid anilide, yet another chemical derived from coal tar, was quickly marketed as a profitable fever-reducing drug.
And not surprisingly, Kahn and Hepp went on to make a fortune. But the really significant thing about this discovery is what happened next in Germany. There was huge demand for the new headache powders, and clearly a fortune to be made by anyone who could come up with an even better drug. Well, here at the Bayer Dye Works, there was a young and ambitious chemist called Karl Duisbeck who decided he would give it a go.
Bayer's cellars were full of coal tar chemicals like acid anilide, and Duisbeck set out to see which he could convert into drugs. His first discovery, called phenacetin, was very successful. We now know that, like acid anilide, it's converted in the body into paracetamol. Bayer's factory here grew rapidly on the profits, and so did their ambitions.
Another substance they got really interested in was salicylic acid. Now, because it's derived from coal tar, they thought originally maybe it's an antiseptic. They rubbed it on the skin and swallowed it. Unfortunately, it didn't kill bugs like typhoid. But what it did do, if you had a fever, is it brought it down, and it certainly made you feel better.
Salicylic acid was effective, but it was harsh on the stomach. We use it now to burn off warts. At Bayer's new drug department, research chemist Arthur Eichengrun thought he could see a way of changing the molecule to make it more palatable.
Eichengrun suggested a simple chemical modification which would, in time, lead to the production of two incredibly iconic drugs. One of them, the world's best-selling painkiller. The other, the world's most notorious drug.
It started innocently enough. A young chemist in Eichengrun's team set about modifying salicylic acid using an approach that Eichengrun had suggested. The result was crystals of acetyl salicylic acid. Just as predicted, it no longer upset the stomach quite so much. Eichengrun would eventually name this drug aspirin. Simple chemical modifications could clearly make better drugs. Inspired by this, a chemist in the Bayer team took morphine, that powerful painkiller from poppies, and tried the same reaction to see what would happen. The result was a chemical called diamorphine, better known to us as heroin.
Thank you very much. Both of these drugs, aspirin and heroin, arrived in front of the chief tester, Heinrich Dreser, and he promptly rejected one of them on the grounds that it was dangerous. Ironically enough, the one he rejected was the aspirin, because he said it was bad for the heart. But he loved heroin. In fact, he named it because of the associations with heroic, powerful, and with his ringing endorsement behind it, heroin was soon being marketed to the world by Bayer.
The team at Bayer had accidentally made a far more addictive version of morphine, and naturally it sold fabulously. Meanwhile, Eichengruen, irritated that his drug aspirin was being overlooked, began secretly to carry out tests.
Eichengruen was convinced the new drug was safe, so he got hold of a sample and he tried it. Nothing untoward happened. So next, secretly, he got hold of some Berlin doctors and persuaded them to try it on their patients.
It was given to a small number of doctors and a dentist, and a report came back from the dentist. He said, I gave it to one of my patients who had a fever, but to my astonishment, he said his toothache had been eased by taking the acetyl salicylic acid. It relieved pain.
This was completely unexpected. The original salicylic acid brought down fevers, but it didn't have any effect on toothache. Eichengruen had clearly created something new and powerful.
So Eichengruen decided to bypass Draeser and went to the head of research at Bayer. He authorized more tests, and in 1899, a year after Bayer had introduced heroin to a grateful nation, they started marketing this new drug.
Aspirin became one of the world's most successful drugs. 40 billion tablets are eaten every year. And it was all thanks to chemists tinkering with an industrial waste product, coal tar.
It was an early illustration of how a simple chemical modification to an existing molecule could make a far superior drug which had additional properties. The additional properties of aspirin are due entirely to the acetyl group. Without the acetyl group it wouldn't work. And rather amusingly, I keep reading reports of how in ancient times plants containing salicylates were used as painkillers. It's nonsense. They might have been used as painkillers. They didn't work. The acetyl group of aspirin, which was a synthetic drug, had to be present in order to kill pain.
Despite its universal appeal, it took people more than 70 years to understand how aspirin actually works. Turns out, nothing like the opiates, such as morphine. Aspirin acts locally and blocks pain long before it gets to the spinal column. I'm going to demonstrate using my least favorite plant, stinging nettles. Ah, yeah, that hurts. Ooh.
Damaged or irritated tissue releases a lot of chemicals, which can help healing, but which all see the results as red, swollen marks, inflammation. And the same process is often the cause of headache and muscle ache.
Aspirin and the other anti-inflammatories all work in the same way, and they block a range of pains.
Anti-inflammatories stop your body producing the chemicals it normally does when tissue has been damaged. This not only prevents swelling, but also the release of chemicals that set off the pain nerves.
As well as blocking pain, aspirin also blocks the hormones that lead to platelet production, which means that middle-aged men like me take small amounts of it to reduce our risk of getting heart attack, which is pretty ironic when you consider that aspirin was originally rejected on the grounds it is bad for the heart.
Chemists had found ways to ensure that we were no longer reliant on plants for our medicines. Modifying simple molecules extracted from coal tar had given us more powerful drugs than the natural world could provide.
With misplaced confidence, chemists now decided they were going to try and design drugs from scratch. The hope was they could produce something lucrative with few side effects. The reality was they now unleashed onto a wholly unsuspecting world a whole new Pandora's box of powerful potions.
This new phase, trying to make entirely synthetic drugs, started as an attempt to correct the limitations of surgical anesthesia. Ether was an irritant and made people sick. Chloroform, discovered soon after, caused unacceptably high death rates.
Perhaps what was needed was a different way of delivering anesthetic chemicals into the body.
The hypodermic needle had been invented in the 1840s, and injecting anesthetics via veins seemed promising.
When you breathe in a drug, what you're trying to do is get a level of the drug into the brain. And so if you put it in intravenously, it goes to the brain faster.
So, in 1869, German chemist Oskar Lieberich naively started to experiment with a substance called chloral hydrate, which had been created many years before. The chemical was known to produce chloroform when you added an alkali to it.
So Lieberich thought to himself, if I inject this into the blood, which is mildly alkali, then perhaps I will produce chloroform inside the body. He thought it was worth doing. It was certainly a bold thing to do, because instead of trial and error, he was relying on chemical theory. Well, it all seemed to go splendidly at first. He injected it into patients, and they did indeed fall asleep.
His reasoning was flawless, but also completely wrong. Chloral hydrate did not produce chloroform when injected into blood, but a form of alcohol, which did not numb feeling or pain. What Lieberich had stumbled upon was not a painkiller, but a drug that put people to sleep.
Chloral hydrate was used in some operations, and if a few patients woke up screaming in the middle of it, well, they had no memory of doing so afterwards.
A way of putting people to sleep safely and quickly would be a real boon for surgery, but chloral hydrate had its drawbacks.
It upset the veins, it caused phlebitis, irritation in the veins, and the duration of action was very long. So patients were very, very sleepy for a long time. They didn't wake up clear-headed and bounce back to work or anything.
But for those who wanted a long sleep, it was great. Chemists produced a form that could be taken as a pill, the world's first sleeping tablet. And within 10 years, Britons were taking a ton of it every day.
Chloral hydrate soon entered popular culture. In 1903, a Chicago newspaper reported that a saloon manager had persuaded his employees to put chloral hydrate into the drinks of customers suspected of having money. And then, afterwards, they would rub them. His name, Mickey Finn, became slang for any spiked drink. Now, the importance of chloral hydrate was not just that it was incredibly popular, but it was really one of the first drugs to have been designed from scratch with a specific purpose. The floodgates were open for any imaginative chemist to make a lot of money.
It was a huge incentive. And with their increasing knowledge of which molecules had this sedative effect, they turned out hundreds of new compounds. One of them was to prove a worthy, albeit infamous successor to chloral hydrate.
Because of its use by criminals, chloral hydrate gained a somewhat notorious reputation. But it would in turn spawn an even more notorious anesthetic, sodium thiopental, otherwise known as the truth drug.
And I'm about to try it.
Sodium thiopental is part of a group of drugs called the barbiturates, and barbiturates were particularly popular in the 1950s and 60s as a form of sleeping pill. They were also very dangerous. Famously, Marilyn Monroe died from a barbiturate overdose. Sodium thiopental was much faster acting than most barbiturates, and that made it a great anesthetic. But, oddly enough, it doesn't actually affect pain.
What barbiturates do is slow down all the messages being sent between nerves in the brain and the spinal column. The more barbiturate there is, the harder it is for chemical messages to cross the gaps between one neuron and the next. So, essentially, your whole thinking process slows down until you fall asleep. With thiopental, that happened very quickly indeed. And that was just what the anaesthetists in the 1930s wanted. As thiopental starts to act, it affects your brain bit by bit. And this is the key to one of its more controversial uses. The Americans noticed that when patients were in that twilight zone halfway between consciousness and unconsciousness, they became more chatty, disinhibited, and also forgot what they'd been talking about afterwards. They decided this might form the basis for a truth drug, an interrogation drug. Now, I'm going to have a go at trying to maintain the fiction that I am Dr. Michael Mosley, the famous heart surgeon. Okay, so I'm actually feeling quite anxious at the moment. Sodium thiopental has a reputation, not just as a truth drug, but also because it's used in lethal injections. Anaesthetist Austin Leach will be monitoring my vital signs throughout. These will indicate if my body is feeling pain. Before I take the drug, he wants to see how my heart rate responds when he crunches his knuckles against my chest. That's quite uncomfortable, yeah. My heart rate jumped from 54 to 64 in response to pain. Now it's time to experience the effects of a light dose of sodium thiopental.
I'll just give a small dose, but quite rapidly. It's in now.
Yeah. Doesn't feel like anything.
Oh, it hasn't got there yet.
That's probably why I'm not feeling anything. Am I feeling just a bit? Oh, yes, there it goes. Yep, there it is. Blimey, wow. Oh, geez, yeah. That is like, oh, that's like drinking a bottle of champagne. So, under the influence of thiopental, can I still lie about my job? I am a cardiac I'm a cardiac surgeon.
And would you like
I'm a world-famous cardiac surgeon.
Would you like to tell me what the last operation you carried out was?
It was a bypass. They survived. But, yeah, I was awesome.
And now I'm just going to repeat the pain test.
Yeah, okay.
In your sternum, and tell me how uncomfortable this is.
That hurts, but it doesn't really hurt. I'm kind of aware of it, but I don't care. It's actually quite painful. My heart rate jumps right up. My body is still responding to pain, but bizarrely my brain isn't. It's all very odd. That is so strange. I had just about managed to lie about my job, however unconvincingly. But what would happen if he upped the dose? Oh, yes. The drug's effects aren't predictable, so I don't know what will happen. Yeah. Ask me any questions.
So, what is your name?
My name is Michael Mosley.
And what is your profession?
I'm a television producer. Well, executive producer. Well, presenter. Some mix of the three of them.
So, you don't have any history of performing cardiac surgery?
None whatsoever. None whatsoever. I am, without doubt, a good television presenter and a lousy cardiac surgeon. Part of the reason I caved in so quickly is I had this overwhelming urge to tell the truth. It's an odd feeling, quite cathartic. The weird thing is I don't want to lie. You know, I'm feeling so... It's not just that I can't. It's just I feel so benign towards the world, I don't want to do it. I don't want to say I'm Michael Mosley, a cardiac surgeon, because I'm not. So, What else I admitted to under the drug's influence must remain forever secret. From me as well. Afterwards, I realized I had forgotten everything that had happened. Did I confess to the fact that I'm not a cardiac surgeon?
So you can't remember? You can't remember what it was you said about your professional status?
No. And I don't know what I was talking about. Yeah. I feel quite snoozy. I feel like I can probably go to sleep now. And that's the reason thiopental became such a popular anesthetic drug. It puts you to sleep quickly and with just a simple injection. It was a triumph for the chemist. A drug that did exactly what it was designed to do. But it was only designed to make people unconscious during surgery, not to stop them feeling pain. For that, they need to take a pain-killing drug, and developing new methods of pain relief is now a major focus for pharmaceutical chemists.
Because we can build pretty well any molecule of any shape we want now by design, that's the way in which pharmaceutical companies are increasingly oriented. It sounds simple. It's actually very, very hard.
The way chemists create new drugs is essentially the same way they did 100 years ago, when they started experimenting with coal tar. They take simple molecules and build them up into complex ones.
These days, you'll not be astonished to hear things are much more high-tech. Most new drugs start out in a so-called compound library, like this one. There are over 3 million different molecules here.
With this vast repository of molecules to start from, chemists can put together almost any compound. But there is still the problem of knowing which compounds will be useful. And in the search for the perfect painkiller, a clue to that has come from a most unusual place. A few very rare people born without the ability to feel pain. In the past, they might have ended up in freak shows. But today, some doctors see them as the key to finding a new class of pain-killing drugs.
So we knew long before we even started thinking about drug development that whatever we found in these patients would be a great target for a drug because this would reproduce the pain-free existence they have.
So researchers studied families with this condition to find out what was happening inside their bodies.
It turns out these people have inherited a faulty gene, which means that their nerves cannot transmit pain signals.
While all their other nerves are normal, their pain nerves are unable to send electrical messages. Identifying the problem gene pointed to a particular protein, a protein that is necessary for us to feel pain.
Once they'd found the protein, the next thing they had to do was see if they could block its action in normal people. See if they could temporarily switch pain off.
The problem with building a molecular key is you may not be selective enough. It's no good switching off pain if you also switch off other essential protein production.
You want to make sure that it is very selective, that it doesn't have major effect on other enzymes in other crucial pathways in the body. Now you have a real lead. Then you have to show that this is really non-toxic.
Drugs that appear to block just that crucial protein are now undergoing a long process of testing. And so far, they are showing great promise. The hope is they will usher in a new era of pain relief.
Now you can see that there is an opportunity to think about a new approach to treatment of pain that offers hope for millions.
The journey from herbal medicines to synthetic drugs designed and made from scratch has taken a mere 200 years. It has been driven by obsession, need, happy and sometimes less happy accident. And yet some things have not changed.
Over the last couple of centuries, we have developed a huge range of pain-killing drugs, from anesthetics to aspirin. But if I was in terrible pain, then the substance I would still use is this, morphine. It is very strange to think that in the 200 years since it was first isolated by Friedrich Zertner, we have developed nothing which is as effective for treating excruciating pain as this extraordinary substance.
开始。好，那影片，那相信大家每个人看到的观点角度都会不同。那我还是把重点先带一下哈。在距今不久，也就是200-300年前，当时没有 就是没有发明任何的一些止痛药以及麻醉药之前呢，那大家也看到了，就是病人要被五花大绑，然后去做手术。然后自从1803年第一次分离出鸦片中的生物碱吗啡之后，那止痛药的历史发展史就开始了。那里面有讲到吗啡的作用机转及副作用等。那这边的话就是会让大家在报告里面比较着重的部分，因为报告的话大家不要就是去讲很多历史啊或什么的部分，就是着重在讲那个药物它的作用机转、副作用、应用等等这些会比较好。老师比较喜欢看这部分，不要讲历史啊，要不然会有点流水账。好，那个包含吗啡类的这一大类的哈，那不知道大家对于就是鸦片类的药物认识有多少？或许药理可能讲了，或许有些同学还没开始讲。那大部分在讲吗啡的时候，它就是一大类。那当然吗啡是代表，所以如果回去之后你觉得大家怎么都做吗啡，那你想要特别一点的话，你当然可以去找鸦片类的相关的药物。那临床上常用的就是什么 fentanyl 啊、pethidine 啊等等等等的。那下面的话就是包含了它副作用，就是有疼痛、恶心、便秘，以至于到后面为什么就是在之前。虽然也有鸦片滴剂，就是把鸦片泡酒这样的方式，在以前的时候，但为什么不好或者说不被常用？因为它的副作用会大到呼吸抑制，甚至是死亡。所以在没有定量之前的一个时代，其实它并不算是一个就是止痛药开启的一个就是比较就是科学化的时代。那真正科学化是等到它的有效成分正式从植物里面分离出来，并且可以定量之后。那时候的止痛药才开始它的就是属于在它那个就是大范围使用。那右边的话就讲到说，就是吗啡类药物就是止痛的一个作用。那这边的话就不赘述，让大家在作业的地方发挥。好，第二个部分的话就讲到麻醉。那麻醉史的话就从气体开始，包含了就是一开始的笑气，并不是用来麻醉的，它是用来笑气 party， 然后乙醚。大家都知道啦，就是有时候新闻事件都常会有一个这个名词出现。那大家是专业人员，所以相信大家素养都是很好。这个是否麻醉或是实验用的哦，千万不是其他一些奇怪的用途上使用的。那最后到了氯仿，氯仿的话就是接近了现代就是在麻醉器，就是大家。现在有很多是从 chloroform 去修饰过来的一些麻醉气体，然后不同的一些卤素原子等等的。那有一些现在还是被用来作为诱导麻醉前期的一个吸入的使用。那大家如果有就是关注或是有 follow 到外科手术，尤其是在麻醉室这一块的话，那一定会有看到就是病人带着他的 mask， 然后开始就是诱导麻醉。好，那就是前面的话就在讲到，就是由英国化学家就是去发现亨佛莱戴维。那这个想出名一定有风险啊。前期的这个笑气实验用在手术上，也不知道那一个 case 到底是真的成功还是假成功，还是他并没有先像后面的那个专业麻醉师一样，先做一个控决测试，去测试看看他现在诱导深度到底够不够，所以他就拔牙了。那这个失败与成功，其实有时候往往就是在精不精细，或者是就是一点点小细节上。不过后来呢，用乙醚去进行就是颈部肿瘤切除这个实验是绝对是。就是在麻醉史上是绝对成功的一次案例哦。好，那就是影片说到的乙醚的一个吸入器。那在讲完了鸦片类药物以及麻醉气体之后呢，那非鸦片类药物也是在后来由于化学家的一个积极的一个发展之下，然后应运而生。我们看到在这边，它由煤焦油的衍生物去做 就是去做一个就是化学的一个修饰，那也在那个就是真的是一次美丽的误会之下，然后把原本是樟脑丸要给病人一个耐丸，然后最后给了苯氨酸。那苯氨酸他刚刚说了嘛，是原本是工业用的，苯氨酸会在体内转换成乙酰氨基酚，那中文看不太懂，那英文的话叫 acetylparaaminofen， 就是 acetaminophen， 就是普拿疼啦，就这个东西啊，吃到现在还在用，这就知道了。好，那贝尔这个德国大药厂，自从阿司匹林被研制出来之后，到现在还是屹立不摇的大药厂，就是年收入可能是在各国药厂里面也是排名前面的，就因为他曾经成功的研发了就是几个好用的药物。那它总共有几个齁？那 phenacetin 就是比较早的，那后来他们从植物中就是有分离出水杨酸，但是会伤胃，而且只能退烧，不能止痛。在经过了化学修饰之后呢，得到了阿司匹林。那阿司匹林的话，就是所有的就是非类固醇抗发炎药的一个就是 NSAID 的一个第一个被合成修饰出来的药。那个 aspirin 呢，它就是大卖嘛。刚刚在讲到说，阿司匹林它一开始只是想要给病人退烧，后来发现它有止痛的效果，所以其实像这种 NSAID 类都是有止痛退烧两个作用的。那尤其是在那个就是后面阿司匹林它还被发现了小量的阿司匹林，小量低剂量的，它有一个就是预防心血管 event 的一个作用。其实它就是主要是否那个就是血栓的那个就是抑制血栓的生成啦，但是它在那个手术上，尤其是拔牙的时候，牙科最就是每次一定会问病人说啊，你有没有吃心脏用药啊？你吃哪一颗啊？吃 Boki 哦，那你有没有停药？有些会问为什么？因为会出血，好吧？所以有时候这些东西就是发展到一个程度，然后有了这个作用，然后就会有另外一个领域的或者说另外一个副作用的出现。所以，但是这不一定哦。我有看过学长他们还好啊，觉得小手术啊没差啊，就吃啊，没关系，反正就是有状况的话再回来就好了。也有，但是就学理上来说，吃低剂量阿司匹林去预防那个心血管。就是预防血栓或是预防一个 stroke 的情况的时候，在进行拔牙手术前，应该要先跟医师好好沟通一下，看到底是不是要停药。那停药的话，通常是要停1个礼拜。那为什么呢？这可能也是一个题目啊。就是如果大家有想要走这一块的话，就是为什么拔牙前要停用 aspirin 这样子。好，那后来是一个可怕错误，就是 morphine， 然后经过修饰之后变成 heroin， 还卖了一阵子，对啊。所以就算大如贝尔药厂的话，它也是曾经有一些不是很好的事件出现这样子。好，那接下来讲到静脉注射麻醉。那静脉注射麻醉的话，一开始讲到的是 chlorhydrate 水和氯醛，然后直接注射，希望可以达到预防。后来发现它只会让人睡着而已，作用跟酒精其实差不多的。其实讲到这里，因为看到后面这么 chill 的影片，就觉得其实如果有观察到一些 YouTuber 啊，或者身边有一些朋友爱喝酒的，其实状态跟那个就差不多啊，就喝完之后就很 chill 啊，然后问他什么，然后隔天都不记得这样子。对，所以奉劝大家就是饮酒适量，最好不要。那喝多了就自己找地方，要不然你隔天你一定会不记得的。那发生什么事，但是你朋友都会记得，所以你就会被耻笑一辈子这样。好啦，回归正题，反正就是它会有安眠作用。那后来继续在那个静脉注射里面，就是发现了还有 Cylpental 这一个，那它只是失去意识，仍然会疼痛。所以这边 Cylpental 它是属于一个 barbiturate 的药物。那现在呢，在临床上其实还有很多像那个像他说这个 Cylpental 啊，是那个玛丽莲梦露，她当时因为吃打过量，然后就挂了嘛。 那我们知道那个 Michael Jackson 他好像是打那个应该是 Propofol 啦，但是实际应该是啦，就是因为流言实在太多。那最近不是有个韩星也是打那个牛奶针，然后也好像也出了点状况啊。好，简言之，它临床上麻醉用，它是管制药品，所以一般的人非医疗或是你不在那个就是合理使用下去施打，第一，它就是管制药品，所以第一个它就是触法的，所以先不论这东西它到底一般人那个能不能用，首先他能拿到这个东西呢，它就一定是违法的。好，那打太多会挂掉这个 barbiturate， 所以后续的话，如果对于巴比托盐类的比较这一块比较有兴趣的同学，可以朝这方向去写这样子。那最后讲到说止痛的新药，那他们就是这边影片是带一个啊，就是说一个基因缺陷的人，他感受不到疼痛。我记得有一个韩片好像也是讲一个男主角是感受不到痛，然后女主角是对疼痛异常敏感，然后就有两个人啊巴拉巴拉，反正韩剧嘛就这样。但是主要是这个疾病是真的存在于基因缺陷的部分。然后如果对于就是这一部分有想要深入的，也可以朝这方向去写。好，那讲到这里就开始讲大家这一节课什么都可以，就是什么都可以忘没关系，就这一个一定要记得。好啦，那个第一个就是要写什么？我们这一堂课主要的是疼痛跟麻醉，那选择一个与疼痛麻醉相关的药物一个就好了，然后去撰写。那时限的话，今天是6号，好，那就2个礼拜。哦，对，2个礼拜。然后在4月20号的晚上之前，那其实我把时间是开到4月21的0:00啊，但大家不要压那么早，我就是这边的时限是写4月20号的晚上11点前。那写什么呢？主题到底是什么呢？比如说你想写吗啡，那我剩下面有几个，就是包含你可以如果说吗啡的话，那比如说疼痛的控制的药物及其止痛机转。那如果你想要写吗啡的止痛机转，它到底是作用在哪一个 receptor？ 一说到机转的话，可能就是大家就要想到有受体这样子的概念，或者是它对于哪一个神经元，或者是它对于就是由脊髓传入，还是说它是在局部，这些都不一样，对啊，它是中枢性的，还是它是借由阻断神经传导，还是说它是借由降低了氯离子的，就是氯离子增加氯离子传导，或者减少钠离子传导等等等等等，就是包含受体、神经传导等等的这些比较归类为机转，所以大家写的时候请贴合主题，对，然后不管是鸦片类还是 NC 类都可以。那如果鸦片类的话，像刚刚大家有看到成瘾机转也可以。那副作用，恶心呕吐，对，恶心呕吐、便秘，然后那个呼吸抑制，然后等等的，就是在肠胃道、在中枢、在各个方面，它都有它的一个就是 opiate 的一个副作用。那这样子的话也可以挑这个主题。麻醉气体如果要写这一块的话，第3个的话就是主要在 onset 跟 duration 嘛，因为有些气体或是针剂那个的麻醉药，它诱导很快，然后但是很快就作用就没了。那有些的话呢是诱导很慢，然后但是它持续了很久，都不一样，所以大家可以挑一个有兴趣的去做这样子。那巴比托盐刚刚讲过了。那止痛药的新发展方向的话，这边是提到了有关于基因。那如果大家对于什么其他的类似的就是新药的发展的潜力也可以写。那再来就是第6个就比较开放式，如果影片中有其他提及你觉得与药理相关，然后想写的也可以。作业的话，我把它放在那个就是学习平台，然后我有开一个作业角区。OK， 那看起来那个你们应该是2个班嘛，两个牙医跟护理， 因为那个主代老师应该是开2个区域，所以就各自教各自的就可以了。好，那时限一样在这里，我是让大家写到4月20号，2个礼拜。那内容及评分项目，好，评分。如果制式化的话，就照这3个 part 去写就可以了。那第一个小的部分就先简介一下你选了哪一个药，对，它是属于麻醉还是止痛的，还是哪一个？先简单讲。最主要的就是讲它的作用机、转及应用 ，OK？ 所以大家一定要贴合这个最主要的部分，然后剩下20%是写心得。那怎么拿高分呢？不要跑题，对，不要跑题，千万不要跑题，对，就是不要写了很长的药物简介，然后作用机转写2行，很难给分，真的很难给分。不要跑题，好不好？那个配分有在上面，不要跑题。那如果有引用文献就更好啦。那大家不是应该都那个学校图书馆网站都有，就是 Up to Date 或 PubMed 等等的。然后因为有引用文献，那有时候一看大概会知道这个是诊断照抄，还是说有稍微整理过。我比较喜欢有整理过的。然后如果有图有表的话，可以放上来佐证。那记得如果有就是有引用或是有图表的话，要记得摘录一下出处。那接下来是一些注意事项啦。中英文反正就是12号字体，然后标楷或 Times New Roman， 然后要写班级姓名学号，这些都比较基本。那内文的部分，内文就是不含一些主题啊、一些参考文献啊、姓名等等的。内文至少需500字，好不好？那500字不多，所以如果大家500字，然后可是引用了4-5个 reference， 那其实也很漂亮，就不用写得很 low 的，就是主要是看大家挑一个药物，然后你真的去找这药物的机转跟临床应用，然后最后再写一下那个小你对于做完这个报告或是影片心得都可以，500字，好，不要多，不要多，好。那引用文献的话要列出来，这是一个就是基本的。然后上限有上限，就是含图、含字、含参考文献，最多只能6页，好不好？最多只能6页。所以以上有没有问题？没有问题，现在可以讲。好，那如果没有问题的话，2个礼拜，好不好？下礼拜4之前，那希望大家都可以就是简单500字，然后挑自己有兴趣的，获得东西比较重要。好，那我们这一堂课就到这里，下课。